Welcome back, guys, to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm fortunate to have Triston Francis. Triston is a consultant at Boston Consultants Group um, in the Singapore office, and he is also a 2019 Harvard MBA graduate and a 2012 graduate of Wharton for his undergraduate degree. Triston, thank you for joining me.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So set the scene for us. Take it back to the beginning, where you grew up, the time period, and what are some of the
Yep.
things that stand out?
Yep. So I'm originally from Jamaica, Queens, and I have two older brothers. My dad moved to the US. My dad moved to New York in his 30s. Met my mom, who, white woman from Cleveland. She with Russian and Czechoslovakian roots. My dad is Jamaican, has always lived there up until he was 30. They met in New York, which is kind of, I guess, where my story begins. So that's where I grew up. Two older brothers. There's a big turning point in my life where at the age of 11, I went from public school in New York to private school. This was a public school, specifically to a boarding school in Massachusetts. This was a big turning point because up until that point, I really struggled academically. I was in a community that, a lot of people didn't go to college. The schools were relatively under-resourced. It was easy to fall through the cracks, and I certainly was falling through the cracks. I was always on the verge of being held back. But fortunately, I caught a break in my life in that my one of my older brothers, he was always in the New York City Talented and Gifted programs. And through that and through a nonprofit organization in New York called Prep for Prep, he was able to get placed into a boarding school in Massachusetts. And then even though I didn't have the academic performance to be able to get into that nonprofit Prep for Prep, which is competitive to get into, my mom was able to go straight to the boarding school, and she was able to say, the older brother's here, he's doing well, can you take can you take the younger one as well? And so I kind of got into this boarding school largely because my brother was there, my brother was doing well, and my mom had the foresight to see that this would set me up as well, and to pose the question. So a lot of early lessons that now, when I reflect back on how pivotal that stage was, a lot of lessons in terms of, being proactive, thinking outside of the box. Not so. I mean, I've adopted that approach in my own life since then, but in this case, I'm more so thinking about, my mom creating the opportunity for me and so forth. Um, and then I get to this boarding school. I Now, when I look back on this boarding
Can I
school,
can I just interrupt?
yep, go
Just
for it.
to all right. So, um, you talked about your mom was from Czechoslovakia.
No, no, no. My mom is from Cleveland, but she has her roots are Russian and Czech.
Okay, and was that something? The multiple identities of your parents. Was that something that was tough to navigate at all in your
Yeah,
childhood?
it's funny. I There's this blogger who has a piece that she does around Black people who are living throughout Asia, and I just recently finished this whole piece where I talked about my identity and how, my identity is somebody who's biracial, and how I've kind of seen myself in these different environments that I've lived in. And I'd say that when I was growing up, the biggest thing was, uh, if I was with my mom, because she has white skin, people would kind of think that I wasn't necessarily her son, or classmates would stare, I should say.
Wow.
Versus if I was with my dad, it'd be the same thing because his skin color is much darker than mine.
Yeah.
And so it's like, regardless of which parent picked me up, classmates would stare. I, kids can not knowingly sometimes, but kids can find any sort of excuse to make fun of somebody. So, you know quote unquote, I had kids when I was younger make fun of me for being adopted. And I think that does, force me to kind of, it forces you to think about race and identity at a very young age. So I do think that have been forced to think about my race and identity since I was a really young kid. And then,
Do you
you
remember at
know,
what age you were kind of aware of? being
Uh,
biracial?
as far like I feel like as soon as I started going to school, which
Wow.
I
Okay.
guess would be like 4 or 5, or because I think kids have a tendency, especially little kids, they just stare with curiosity if there's something they're not used to seeing.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that it's not like where I was, people were used to every sort of race under the sun. So it's not like they weren't used to seeing somebody who was black or somebody who was white or somebody who was Hispanic, Russian, Asian, whatever it might be. But I think the a biracial family, I mean, it's more and more common as every year goes on. But
Yeah.
I still think that when I think about my own childhood, I don't think that if I think about many of my friends, I don't think that many of them um, were biracial. I can't remember examples of that. So it kind of felt like I was an outlier in that regard, which I think is what leads to the stares from classmates.
Yeah. What was Jamaica Queens like?
Uh, I mean, it was, I moved when I was 11.
Okay.
So I moved to boarding school when I was 11. And it's funny because I don't think you get a full experience for a city or a neighborhood before you're 11. Your life is more or less controlled by your parents. So my version of Jamaica Queens was, a lot of time in the park playing basketball, and really good pizza shops and yeah, that's kind of when I think of Queens. I know it was a super diverse neighborhood in terms of languages spoken, ethnicities, places people came from, all that kind of stuff. So I just remember Queens as this place where you see anything and everything in terms of type of person. And yeah, I love it. I think it's a great melting pot. Obviously, the schools that I was going to weren't particularly well resourced, but I think that it was a good kind of environment in terms of just learning street smarts, which is something that I think is invaluable as well. So, in some ways, what you don't learn in the classroom from an academic perspective, you learn in other forms of life skills that serve you well. So yeah, I think back to my time in Queens pretty fondly. I'm happy that I'm from there, although I don't know the experience of being from anywhere else, but I certainly have a lot of love for the area.
At that time, before you were 11, what type of kid were you? What type of um, things were you thinking about? Um, aspirations you might have had?
Yeah, I was, in terms of the type of kid I was very, I was quiet. I've always been on the quieter, softer spoken side. I'm introverted. I'm not really shy like I used to be, but as a kid, I was extremely shy. The story that my mom always likes to tell is when I was going to Sunday school, I guess I had been going there for a while, and then one day she went to pick me up, and the teacher, I basically, I said something. I was excited to see my mom, and I said something to her, and the teacher kind of, pulled my mom aside a little bit puzzled and was like, I didn't think he was able to speak. So I think
Oh my
she
god.
actually thought that like I just literally never said anything. So I kind of kept to
Okay.
myself.
Yeah.
I would create games and play those games by myself. So I think from that perspective, I probably was, yeah, I was kind of just, I had a few very close friends, and I just kept to myself for the most part. I was quiet. Yeah,
Cool. Cool. Did you have like interests like sports or
yeah,
um
basketball. Basketball
yeah.
was all my free time. I loved going to the park and playing basketball. And then I had this little fake hoop in the living room of my apartment, like those little plastic
Yeah.
balls, and I would just spend all my time like shooting that. So definitely sports, baseball as well. I liked baseball a lot, but I liked basketball even more. Pokemon cards. I had a fantastic collection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say
Cool.
those were my big things, probably basketball, baseball, and Pokemon.
Cool. Cool. So you alluded to it a little bit before, but so at 11 years You made a change to a private school. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it was a boarding school in Massachusetts.
Cool. Um, what was that transition like?
At first, the transition was tough. And my brother and I would joke that we made up like 30% of the black population at this school.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of an adjustment, especially when you're coming from Queens and you're just used to seeing everything. And then on top of that, there was a very big difference in terms of the socioeconomic upbringing from a lot of students at this school versus the kind of environment that my brother and I grew up in. And I just felt like I've never, when I was younger, growing up, I never necessarily felt like I didn't have things, material things.
Yeah.
Um, and then there was this period where, because none of my friends growing up had it, right? Like you have all the same stuff that your friends in your neighborhood have. And then I went to this boarding school and I grew up around people who, came from extreme wealth. And I kind of saw the lives that they had, the cities they were mentioning, the places that they've traveled to, the countries that they had been to. And I had never kind of, with the exception of going to Jamaica or Canada, I had never really like traveled, but Jamaica wasn't like luxury travel. It was
Yeah.
going to,
Home. Yeah.
spend time with my dad's side of the family.
Yeah.
Um, but there was just a difference in terms of lifestyle that they had versus what I had. So I think when you're 11 years old and that gets thrown in your face, it's a little bit it takes a little bit of adjusting to get used to. I missed my friends. I realized when I went to this boarding school, I wasn't that good at basketball. I used to be, it's kind of like when you go into the next league
Yeah.
and then you realize, like, oh man. So I went from being one of the better people that I knew um, to kind of being around people that was like, oh wow, these people are, a lot better at basketball than me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that took some adjusting to get used to, and some of that was just simply height.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but no, at first when I first moved to this boarding school, I had a really difficult time in the first month or so. I was for the most part kind of crying myself to sleep. I really wanted to go back to New York, but I knew that my mom wanted me to stay in this boarding school in Massachusetts. So I decided to do what I could to put my head down and make it a better experience. And that started with academics for me because I never really, up until that point, took my academics all that seriously. I had never read a book until the seventh grade, so I was like really far behind from a reading level perspective. And I just started really focusing on my academics because I knew that that was one of the things that was difficult for me, as I didn't feel smart enough to speak up in these settings. So by focusing on my academics, I was able to kind of I was able to get to a point of confidence that I needed to get to. Um, so yeah, that's what a lot of those years look like from, I guess that would have been seventh, eighth, and ninth grade at that boarding school.
Can you talk a little bit about, with the difference in socioeconomic background, does that create an inferiority complex? I mean, so how do you adjust? Are you do you try to pretend or do you
No,
uh,
I never went through a phase where I tried to pretend.
okay.
And for me, it was more so just like this trying to relate. Um, and, as an example, if somebody's talking to you about the travel that they've done to this part of the world and that part of the world and this part of the world, and they're talking to you about, these ski trips or these, things that you've just never done, there's not much that you can say in response to that. And I think
Yeah.
it's difficult for anybody, but I think it's also particularly difficult for, I was shy and introverted and quiet and soft spoken to begin with, so it's like I didn't have a lot of ammo. If
Yeah.
we were talking about basketball or Pokemon, I could have a conversation, but if we're talking about countries I've never heard of or been to, I don't. It's going to be really difficult for me to jump into the conversation to begin with. And maybe if I was like super extroverted or outgoing or something like that, I could just pose a ton of questions and it wouldn't be an issue. But I think the combination of that, I think, is pretty challenging for, for a kid, because then you don't feel as though you have like the people to be able to talk to. And I, I was a pretty self-sufficient person, typically. Um, but in New York, I always had like my go-to friends. And I felt like when I moved to Massachusetts at first, I didn't necessarily have that. I mean, my brother was there for 1 year, which helped in some ways. It wasn't all that helpful in other ways, and that, like, as a younger brother, you never want every family dynamic is different, but I feel like many family dynamics, as a younger brother, you never want your older brother to kind of view you as, like, quote unquote weak. And so I do think that I probably, you know, didn't necessarily go to him to talk if I was having a difficult time with the adjustment or anything like that, even though he would have been the obvious, person to go to and talk to about it. And
Because you didn't
so
want
I
to
think
bother
that,
him, or
no, it wasn't at all that I didn't want to bother him.
yeah,
I didn't, I knew that he was having like an easy time adjusting, right? And
gotcha.
so I didn't want, there's a little bit, it's not competitiveness, but there's a little bit of like, you don't want to, and I think that as little kids, especially, it was three boys growing up, and you didn't want to come off as like fragile or vulnerable or whatever
Yeah,
it might be. And I don't think that we really had a culture in our family, in our nuclear family, of like discussing feelings and what
yeah,
wasn't, and
yeah.
that's unfortunate, because I think if we did, I think that I would have had a easier adjustment. Although, you know, now when I look back on it, I don't really care that it was a difficult adjustment, because I learned so much in that period. I
Yeah.
learned way more than if I had a comfortable life up through 11, and then went to that boarding school. Like, I wouldn't have learned a fraction of the stuff that I learned about life. And so now I feel like I walked away with these lessons as an 11-year-old that were pretty profound to know as an 11-year-old, and that allowed me to start implementing them as a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, and so forth. And so I think I got actually, I probably got off to a slow start from an academic perspective, but just in terms of like a maturation, I think I got off to a very quick start in life from that perspective. So
How was living alone for the first time as an 11-year-old? So I think a lot of people do that maybe for the first time at 18, but to move
yeah,
states, um,
so it was tough when I first moved there. I missed my friends, I missed my family. But I think that after I kind of started to, because I eventually developed really good friends at this boarding school, and I eventually was able to catch up academically, start to feel a little bit more comfortable, all of this stuff. So, was eventually able to get to a place where I felt really good. And now I look back on this, 3 years in this boarding school as it was a lot of fun, because eventually it got to the point where, we would stay up late in the dormitories and they would be lights out, but you would sneak around, and then you would go and you'd play video games and little things that,
yeah.
like, now seem so ridiculous. Now I'm like, oh man, why didn't I just sleep? But like then I'm like, oh, I got to make it downstairs and into this room somehow without getting caught, so that we can play like NBA 2K on the
That's
computer.
funny. Yeah.
So I think back to boarding school with all of these like fun little experiences.
And it probably helped you with your transition to college, I assume.
It
Like,
definitely helped. I mean,
yeah,
I know that when I got to college, I looked to my right and left, and people were having like a difficult time. I had 6 years of boarding school before starting college. And
yeah,
so there was no part of me that was having any sort of difficulty adjusting to being away, or being away from friends, or these other things that most people hit in their freshman year. I didn't hit. And that actually allowed me to, I think that's one of the unique advantages of going to boarding school, is that you start college well prepared, and it really sets you up to get off to a good start in terms of college, because every little bit counts. And so if you can get out of the gate quickly in college in terms of like building friendships, like living healthy, being on your, all of these stuff that you just have to kind of figure out. Most people figure out when they get to college for the first time. I had a bunch of those things kind of figured out. And so I was able to, I think, get off to a very strong start in college.
Yeah. So what happens after you graduate from the boarding school?
So after I go from that boarding school, I go to another boarding school in New Jersey. At this point, I'm much more comfortable with the boarding school setup. I'm doing much better academically, so I'm able to, perform average to above average but this is in the context of a relatively a very, very strong academic setting. So performing average to above average in that setting is great, as opposed to if you're in a New York City public school system, sometimes you have a student that is knocking it out of the park in that system. They're getting an A+ in that system, but it's the equivalent of like a C in when you actually compare it to what an educational system should be. And I
Yeah.
so in my case, I was doing well in this place academically, but a lot of my teachers in this second boarding school in New Jersey, um, one teacher in particular, realized that there is still a disconnect between how much effort I was putting in and what my results were. Meaning I was doing average to above average, but I was busting my ass in a way that the other people who were busting their ass were doing much better than me.
Mm.
I was kind of putting in that effort to be like and getting results that were average or above average, um, and they it eventually, and particularly I was struggling in terms of like completing tests and things like that, and one of the teachers noticed it, asked if I had been diagnosed with a learning disability before, or tested for a learning disability. I hadn't been tested before. I decided to kind of go through the testing for it, discovered in that process that I was dyslexic, which made a lot of sense in terms of some of the difficulty that I was having with reading growing up. So, I didn't find out that I was dyslexic until the 10th grade, which is very late to discover it, but I'm glad that I did discover it. Once I discovered it, the school set me up with a learning coach. Very simple changes, like listening to audio textbooks as I read along, and coloring system in terms of how I highlighted, where I would highlight a number in green, I would highlight a person in orange, a place in blue, a key fact in yellow, like all of these different things. I had my own system, and for people with dyslexia, it helps you digest the information a little bit more easily. Um, so once I started getting matched up with this learning coach, I went from kind of really, really putting in a ton of effort to get above average, to get average to above average results, to putting in a ton of effort but getting really phenomenal, like very strong results, which is what made going to, like, when I was applying to colleges, I got to the point where there was no college that was like necessarily like out of my reach in terms of like, oh yeah, there's no way you can go to this college type of thing. um, and I had a really good guidance counselor, and I didn't know much about college, but I had a really good guidance counselor. And when I was describing to him my interest in math, which maybe that translates into an interest in business, he was like, well, have you heard of Wharton before? At the time, I hadn't heard of it. He was like, look, they have a really good business program. You apply to the school. I applied to the school, and applied to the school before I had visited. But after getting admitted, I went and I visited, fell in love with the school. I was on full financial aid, so I didn't have to pay the tuition part of it. So at that point, I was into a good rhythm, and I'm definitely very grateful for the experience in college.
Can you talk about, one of the things you said while you were talking about your high school experience is that you worked your butt off. Where did that work ethic come from? What was driving you? Uh, because I think at that age to have that type of work ethic is tough, 14, 15, 16. Where do you think that came from?
I mean, I think that both of my parents have always worked really hard. And so I think if I think about my mom, who, my family was a role reversal in that my mom worked. So my mom is the one who made all the income for our household. My dad took care of the household, cooked, cleaned, all that stuff. Um, and but my mom was always like working multiple jobs, right? So she was a court stenographer, which was her main job. And when she would come to the baseball games, like um, she would bring her work with her, and she'd be sitting in the stands watching the baseball games, like reading, like doing her work.
Yeah.
Or if my mom, she, and then she was also, she worked at American Airlines. She was at the kind of ticket counter, so she was working both of these jobs at the same time. Then on the weekends, sometimes, she would take on additional jobs. So we would go and we would clean office buildings, and she would bring my two brothers and I, and we would clean the office buildings as well. So I think that, like, we just kind of, I grew up thinking it was very natural, um, to work, and realizing that you had to work and all of this stuff. And then, that's on my mom's side. And then, yeah, for sure, my dad's side as well. He wasn't working in the income kind of side of things, but he certainly had this incredible work ethic. I remember, always coming home from school, and he would have just like finished a workout, and the house would be spotless. And he was also somebody that was, working. And then of course now, when you think and you look back on it, like he immigrated from Jamaica to New York. That's not, the thing that he built for himself. And if you look at where, his kids are now, like he, he had a ridiculous work ethic as well. So I think that I'm the product of, and I'm the product of, like, an immigrant family that values uh, work. And so that was kind of the work ethic piece was always in my DNA. It's just what I was applying it to. And when I was a little kid, I was applying it to basketball. And I think I was pretty good at basketball. And I would, apply it to like shooting hoops in the living room, which doesn't really translate into getting better at basketball. I think if I took all of that time that I spent shooting that plastic ball in my living room, if I actually went to the park, I think I'd be even. I think I'd I'd be even better.
Yeah.
I mean, I did go to the park, but I mean, if I, but yeah. So I think that's where the work ethic came from. So I think it was more or less second nature.
Yeah. This is maybe sort of a tough question, but for someone who's, making a move, whether it's to a boarding school or to, uh, a small liberal arts college or something of that nature, um, where it is a difference in, where they grew up and the socioeconomic background of the people at this college or at this boarding school. I mean, do you have any pieces of advice for them?
Well, I think the biggest piece of advice would be, the first and foremost, I don't think that individual has any reason to feel like they don't belong there. And I've gone through a long periods of life where I didn't feel like I belonged in certain places. And um, there's no silver bullet for killing that feeling, though, that lurks inside the back of your head, thinking, maybe I don't belong here. So I won't make any illusions of that being easy to do or anything like that. Um, I'll talk about the things that gave me a lot of confidence and eventually led to me realizing, wait, no, I actually do belong here, and I belong in any room that I find myself in. And the rooms that I don't find myself in, like, I either chose to be there, or they're not good rooms or chose not to be there, or they're not good rooms for me to be. So that's eventually where I got to. And the thing that helped me get there, um, was developing confidence, which came from understanding what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing, and then spending a lot of time doing those things that I enjoyed. And so I didn't really get to that point of really beginning to develop confidence until I was in college, and specifically taking on student leadership and, becoming, running for student government in my freshman year, getting elected to student government, becoming, the president of the largest business group, or the Black Wharton Undergraduate Association, which was the second largest business group. And becoming president of one of the honor societies, becoming a writing tutor, a public speaking coach, a college house RA. Eventually, once I was in college, I started to realize, okay, when it comes to leadership, mentoring, coaching, people related things, I just seem to like these things come more naturally to me. And I'm like, okay, I also have peers when they have questions about navigating some of these people related things that they're working through. It seems like a lot of peers are coming to me for help on this. And I started to realize over time, like, oh, okay, this is something that maybe I'm good at this. And also, okay, this is also something that I enjoy doing. Like it felt really, especially as a first generation college student, when somebody comes to me with this advice or for advice, and I'm able to kind of help them see something that they maybe knew all along. I think that mentors and coaches are oftentimes not providing new information, but rather they're just, helping that person unlock their own potential and see something that they didn't necessarily activate before. And that's all that I was doing. And it felt really good to be able to do it. And so I think that, for that person who's making a transition and is having a really difficult time in the transition, I would just say try to find that thing that you're good at and that you enjoy doing and invest your time there, because when you start to do that, you'll build a lot of confidence, and then you'll start to realize like, oh, okay, this is the thing that I bring to every environment that I'm in. And everybody goes through their own personal journey in terms of figuring that thing out. But for sure, if you're going through this insecure phase and you're able to figure out what that thing is, the back end of it is going to be a lot of confidence that I think will be helpful for people.
Another maybe somewhat tough question for, first generation um, students trying to make it to college, say they're in high school. Any pieces of advice for them on, what they can do to help themselves out with the college process?
Have conversations with people who have gone through college, because I think the most difficult thing as a first generation college student is you don't have access to that within your direct family. So you're not able to walk home and then have a dinner table where you're talking about the college application process and stuff like that. So, if you have access to organizations, like if you're in communities where you have access to organizations that have resources for first generation college students, try to take full advantage of those, because they'll oftentimes match you up with people and help provide you some of the information that you might not have had access to. So I would say, you know, go to events, do everything that you can to try and talk to people who have gone through college and just talk to them about what that experience was, so that you can sort of start to syndicate some of the experiences that people have had who have gone to college.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. So, talk to us a little bit about your junior and senior year of high school and how you chose Wharton. Were you thinking about other schools? Did something in particular stand out about?
Uh, Yeah, so I remember a conversation that I had with my guidance counselor in high school, who was fantastic. I'm still in touch with him to this day. And I remember saying to him that I was interested in, when he asked me what colleges I was interested in, I told him I was interested in math, which was the subject that I loved growing up. So I really struggled more so on the reading, the sciences, everything like that. But like math, I was always good at. Um, and I told him, yeah, well, I think math is my strong suit. And he's like, okay, well, math can mean, being a mathematician, math can mean being an engineer, math can mean business. And I kind of stopped him there and I was like, yeah, business sounds good. And he's like, why? And I think I said something to the effect of because I like the game Monopoly, which is as far as my thinking went in
Yeah.
terms of why I wanted to go to study business in undergrad.
Yeah.
Um, and his point was, well, maybe let's flush that thinking out a little bit more. And he's like, I know of this summer program called Lead, where it's a summer program where it's almost like being a business school student, but you're in high school. But you read cases, you work on a business plan. So I did those. It was at UVA Darden. So I did that for a summer. And I fell in love with business at that point. So I'd say my junior year, going into my senior year of high school, I was like, oh, okay, I like this business thing. This is what I want to do. And I've really never looked back. And I think that business is the right general space for me. So I'm happy with that decision. Um, and yeah, so I did this program, and that's really the what shaped my interest in, I won't say my interest in Wharton, because I didn't know of the school before I applied. So it's not like I grew up wanting to study at Wharton one day or wanting to go to an Ivy League school. I had no aspirations of going to an Ivy League school when I was younger. If I had
Mm.
an aspiration of going anywhere when I was younger, it would be like going to UNC because Michael Jordan went there or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The programs that I knew were the good, like basketball programs where the NBA players came from.
Yep.
Those were the schools that I knew, if any. I didn't, I knew UNC more than I knew Yale.
Yeah.
Um, and So when I was applying to schools, um, having done this summer program at UVA going into the process was my top choice. Um, and my brother was at William and Mary, so my mom had moved to Virginia at that point, and so that my brother could get in-state tuition. And my thought was like, oh, UVA is a really good school, and I'm going to get in-state tuition there. So that's kind of when I was applying to colleges, what I had in mind. And then again, I had this guidance counselor that was like, look, Wharton has a really good business program. You should apply there. So I applied to Wharton. I applied to UVA. I got into both, and with UVA, actually, it would have been more expensive for me to go there, because I ended up getting full financial aid from Penn.
Yep.
Um, and so I think that once I was like, oh, it's actually going to be cheaper for me to go to this other school, which I just never assumed would be the case. Then I went and I visited the schools. And the thing that I liked about Wharton is everybody there seemed to be very, very ambitious about something, right? It wasn't always academics. You certainly had a lot of people who were, go-getters in the classroom. But you had other people that were like trying to start a business, or you had other people that were, trying to further some social cause, or you had people doing all sorts of things. um, and it was across the board, right? Every single person.
Yeah.
And I just felt like a lot of the other schools that I looked at, you had those same individuals, but then you also had a lot of other people that just, no other way of saying it, but they were like just not about that life, and they just weren't that motivated and whatever it might have been. And look,
Yeah.
they're probably going through a maturation process, so there's no judgment there, but
Yeah.
I find it like super inspiring to be around motivated, ambitious people. And I felt like motivated, ambitious, but also like, caring, thoughtful, all the things that you'd look for in any way. And I felt like Penn was just a good collection of all of that stuff. So I love the school. I went there. I had an amazing 4 years while I was there.
Talk about I guess, your freshman year, that transition. Um what was it like? What's Philadelphia like? What's the academics at Wharton like? Things of that nature.
Yeah. So Philly's a great city to go to school in, right? Because it's relatively, at least me coming from New York, it's relatively affordable. So, versus if I was at Columbia, or if I was at NYU and I was, a college student in one of those places that's super expensive, I feel like
Yeah.
that might be a little bit challenging. Versus Philadelphia, much more affordable from that perspective. The food trucks were amazing. I remember for a few bucks you could get like your sandwiches that were really, really tasty.
Yep.
And Yeah, so I think that because I had been in boarding school for so long, that adjustment was a little bit easier. From an academics perspective, that there was a lot of support at Wharton, and I had gotten used to at this point in my life when I was having difficulty in a subject area, I had gotten used to reaching out for help. So I built that muscle in the previous boarding schools. So that was good. That was good as well. So yeah, I had generally a fairly a positive transition into it. I felt like I was learning a lot when I was at Wharton. I felt like I was able to take on things outside of work. It felt really balanced between kind of academics, extracurriculars, social, all this other stuff.
And so, what did you end up majoring in?
I ended up majoring in finance, legal studies, and business ethics. The finance was largely because um, I wanted to, when I, at that point, I thought I wanted to go into, I knew that I wanted to, after the summer after my freshman year, I interned at Google. And then during that summer internship, a lot of the people that I looked up to, they had started their career either in investment banking or in consulting. And they had gone to either Harvard for business school or they had gone to Stanford in most cases. So in my head, I was like, okay, I would love to do, one of these things. I was like, okay, if I want to go into consulting, you can major in anything. And I was like, okay, if you want to go into investment banking, like finance is probably a good thing to major in, although retrospectively accounting probably would have been a better thing to major in, even if I wanted to go into finance. But so I was like, okay, if I major in finance, then I'm not, it's not a bad major for somebody that's interested in consulting, and it's a great major for somebody that's interested in investment banking. And so the finance side of it was like the me being practical and putting something on my resume that I was like, all right, this is gonna be the right thing for me to put on my resume if I'm trying to get my foot in the door there. The legal studies and business ethics, those were just like when I looked at the courses within that area, like I took 2 negotiations courses in that area. I took a corporate social responsibility course within that area. I took a social impact of sports within that area. So they were just classes that I wanted to take. And it just so happened they were all in the same department. So it kind of, I
Yeah, it
got the
made
additional
sense.
major just like tacked on. But it wasn't like, I went into this with an interest. I never thought that I wanted to do law or anything like that. It was just the courses that I wanted to take happened to be in that space.
Talk to me about the internships you did, how you went about um, receiving those offers and from those companies, and you know what can if you have any advice for current college students on obtaining those internships.
Yeah, my advice would be think outside of the box and don't just rely on the super traditional routes. And I think that if I think about that internship at Google, I got it largely through student government. So I was elected to student government in my freshman year. One of the seniors, when I was a freshman, had worked at Google. He was this guy, I remember meeting him very early on and just seeing the list of things that he did while in college and being completely blown away. So he's one of those people that always I always looked up to, who I was always very inspired by, and he's gone on to, continue to do incredible things, and like, has been in, was doing incredible things at YouTube, and has gone on to, use Forbes 30 under 4 or 30 under 30, and all of these other like really impactful things. And actually, um, in terms of moving to Singapore, when I was trying to think about where I was going to move, uh, I he was the first person that I called, and his recommendation on Singapore was the one that I took most seriously.
Yeah.
So this is somebody that I've kind of stayed in touch with, and was just really inspired by all of the stuff that he has done. He's a really interesting, impressive, thoughtful guy. Um, so he basically, I told him I was interested in Google, and he was like, oh, okay, well, if you're interested in Google, you should talk to a bunch of people on Penn's campus who've interned there. So I like reached out to like every single person that I could find who, was at Google. And then I also, when the recruiters came to campus for this event, and they were actually coming to campus looking for seniors to hire full time, but I just went to the event anyway. And I met the recruiters, and I was like, look, I know you're not looking to recruit for interns, but I'm working on this student government project where we're trying to bring Google Calendars to Penn's campus. And I'm wondering if there's anybody on the Google Calendar team you might be able to put me in touch with. And so they connected me with some people on the Google Calendar team. I had a bunch of conversations with people on the Google Calendar team. I was able to, try and make some progress in terms of bringing it to Penn's campus. And then fast forward the next semester, those same recruiters were back on campus, but this time they were back on campus recruiting for summer interns.
Yeah.
And I remember going up to them, just being like, yeah, thanks so much for like connecting me with all these people on the Google Calendars team. Here's how it's going here. Oh, like I know that you have an internship. I'd love to kind of be able to interview, apply for it, and so forth. So I interviewed for this thing, but really, I think the thing that differentiated me, the thing that allowed me to get my foot in the door, was these relationships that I had built while trying to work on this student government project, and then ended up getting an interview. And I feel like once you have an interview, it's your opportunity, right? You can win it or lose it at that point. And I've just always been the type that I work incredibly hard leading up to that interview. I think through all of the things that they could ask me, all of this stuff, and so I did well on the interview. Ended up doing the internship, and yeah, I loved it. It was a really great experience.
Yep. And then you did a couple more at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley.
Yeah. So at Goldman, I think the thing that helped me get in the foot in the door is a little bit of a snowball effect, right? So if you're a freshman who's done an internship at Google, there aren't a ton of freshmen that have done an internship at Google. So now if you're applying to Goldman, now that's going to stand out a little bit. And in the case of Goldman, there was a student group project that I was working on. And one of the person that I was working on, his friend was working at Goldman, and he basically just shot a message to his friend, and anyway was able to I was able to get the interview with Goldman very much through somebody that I was working on a school project with, who
Yeah.
reached out to his friend and was like, yeah, you got to pull this person into like your pipeline. And that person did, and um, I don't think I would have gotten the interview without that. But um, and then I interned at Goldman, and then again back to that snowball effect. By the time I'm applying for internships in my junior year, and you have Google on your resume, Goldman on your resume, and in both cases, not only did I have the internships, but I had return offers from them. So clearly, it's like, okay, if you're Morgan Stanley at that point, and you're like, okay, this person has worked at Google and they got a return offer at Google. They worked at Goldman and they got a return offer at Goldman. If you're Morgan Stanley at that point, you're like, it's not that risky of a bet to be like, okay, this person's probably going to do just fine.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's why those things tend to snowball one to another. And they certainly did in my case.
Yeah. So it seems like in a lot of these cases that the activities you were doing extracurricularly ended up, you know, maybe not intentionally, but ended up really being valuable in terms of the relationships you made.
For sure. For sure. I think that the relationships at the end of the day have always been the thing that has set me up for success. Being able to find people that I can really connect with, that I know they care about me, that I'm excited by their causes, so I can support their causes and be really excited to support their causes. For me, it's always been about relationships and surrounding yourself with the right people. Because I think if you're surrounding yourself with the right people, and those people are going to have success and so forth, you're gonna be right alongside them as that trajectory goes up.
Awesome. And so talk to me about your mindset going into senior year. Did you already um, sign an offer from uh, Morgan Stanley, or were you considering other roles in other companies?
So you find out that you get the offer a few days before the summer internship ends. And I remember having a conversation with probably the biggest person who has positively influenced my perspective from a business perspective and from a professional lens has been Carla Harris, who's a vice chairman at Morgan Stanley. She has been at Morgan Stanley for over 30 years at this point. In addition to
Wow.
being a banker, she's also a gospel singer. She's had 5 sold out concerts at Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
She performed at Madison Square Garden when at the opening mass for the Pope when he came to New
Wow.
York. She was chair of one of President Obama's national councils. She's on the board of Walmart. She's on the board of Harvard. So she's extremely impressive, very inspiring.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember having a conversation with her after I had gotten the offer from Morgan Stanley because I was torn, right? Like part of me felt like I should go and do something like Teach for America, or I should go and do something philanthropic in nature, just because at this point so much had been given to me that it kind of, there was a part of me that felt like, is it wrong for me to be taking everything that people have invested in me and then using that to go to Morgan Stanley? Is that really, where this path has led me? Um, and I think that it's natural when you're coming out of college to think about the thing through, like, to think about that first job out of college is where the story ends, but it's not at all. Now I realize that, obviously I know that now, that's like, stories barely beginning when you're coming out of college.
Yeah.
Which is what this conversation with Carla helped me realize. She was like, look, you're really passionate about education, you're really passionate about mentorship and professional development, and she's like, these are all of the same things that I'm really passionate about. And she herself was like, in another life, maybe I would have been a teacher, but she's like, I actually think I'm able to have a way bigger impact through the business, through the business seats that I've taken on and so forth. Um, and that made me realize that, the job that you take doesn't have to define the impact that you have. So at that point, that's what gave me the confidence to ultimately decide to like sign with Morgan Stanley, go back there full time. And she's completely right. I think that, you know, the impact that I've been able to have in the private sector, I do think outweighs the impact that I personally could have had in the public, in if I had gone into directly being a teacher. And then part of it is just like, you know, your personality and where you're going to succeed and so forth. And like being a teacher, it's a difficult job. And I think that in addition to being a difficult job, like it's slow moving, right? People don't learn overnight. You don't see results overnight. It's very slow moving. And when it comes to making progress, I'm not a particularly patient person. I like to be able to like put my head down, spend some hours on something and see a result. And that's something that you can do in business, because business is agile, business moves very quickly. If I spend, you know, 10 hours focused on something today, at the end of the day, I'm going to see the difference. I'm going to see a website that I've built. I'm going to see a PowerPoint deck that I've built. I'm going to know that I contacted these, 20 people, whatever it might be, versus as a teacher, you could spend 10 hours with the student. You might not actually see any difference in that student the next day.
Yeah.
Now, yes, you're having an impact on them and that the students need that, but that's not it doesn't match my style. And I realize that. And so I think that it's important to pick, jobs and industries and so forth that match your style. I think you'll be more successful. You'll be happier. If you're happier, you'll be more impactful. And it's just a virtuous cycle from that perspective.
Yeah. So you once you graduate, you start as an investment banking.
Yes.
How is that to people that don't know much about the industry? Maybe talk about the hours and things of that
Yeah.
nature.
No, I mean, it's a job where you're working, I think I was working like 100 hours a week when I joined at first. And so what that practically means is like you're working from like, 9 a.m. until like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. most days. And you're working um, in the office, right? So you're physically in the office from 9 a.m. to like, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. very often. And then, you know, full days on the weekends as well. So, you're going in maybe Saturday, Sunday look like, 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that. So, still like a full 8 hour type of day. I think in my first year, so out of the 365 days in the year, there was like 7 that I wasn't physically in the office,
Yeah.
inclusive of weekends, inclusive of holidays. So it's pretty much working
Jeez.
around the clock.
Yeah.
You learn a lot for sure in a short amount of time. So, that's the trade-off. That's the agreement that you're basically making. So you're giving away a lot of this free time, but in exchange for that, you'll be given a skill set that you can then walk into any team, and you have a basic skill set that will allow you to contribute very early on. So that's helpful. Yeah.
Talk to me about the diversity in investment banking. Was that something, being a person of color, was that something that you immediately saw, like, that there aren't that many people of color, or was that even something that went through your head? Um,
Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, at this point, I had been used to spending most of my time being the only Black person in the room. So, it's no different than a typical classroom
yeah,
at Penn. It's no difficult than what Google was like. It's no different than like Goldman, and so all of these institutions that I've been a part of. It's going back to, so I had boarding school number one, I had boarding school number two, I had Penn, I had Goldman, I had Google. So no, by the time I got to Morgan Stanley, I realized that um, in these highest levels of business, I just realized that they are unfortunately not diverse places. And underrepresented minorities don't really have seats at these tables. So that's just a reality that I kind of knew at that point. So even in my investment banking class, which I think maybe like 120, 130 people, and there were like, I think about 6 or so Black people out of that. So,
yeah,
really small number. And then on top of that, I actually think the more stark realization is actually the gender diversity. So I'll never forget during training, whenever you would have the breaks during training, and then you'd have a line for the restroom, you'd have this massive line for the men's room, and then there'd be absolutely not no line for the women's room. And it's
yeah,
just like counter to any sort of restroom line that you're used to, where the men just like are able to walk in and out really quickly.
yeah,
And there's a line for the women's restroom, which is counter to all of that, because there just were like not really very many women in investment banking. um, and yeah, I just remember always being like, wow, this is unreal whenever we would have those lines for the restroom.
yeah. You did a couple of different roles at Morgan Stanley. Talk about that. Was it easy to transition to sales and trading, and the other roles that you eventually had?
Yeah, so I started in investment banking, and then I moved to sales and trading, and then I moved to a strategy role that was focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients, and then I moved to talent management and HR. So I moved around a lot. That whole period, I knew I eventually wanted to go to business school. So my thought process was, it's better for me to see a holistic set of experiences if I want to go to business school. Plus, I wanted to, if you want to put together a business school application, it's kind of hard to do, not impossible to do, but certainly difficult to do when you're working 100 hours a week. So part of the move to sales and trading was let me get a little bit more hours in the day to be able to prepare, myself for business school. Um, and I think that if you're going from investment banking into sales and trading, you bring a pretty unique skill set at that point in terms of what your strong suits are. And it's not a particularly common path. So you'll have to do some explaining as to why you're interested in doing it. But I don't think that it's
Yeah,
necessarily particularly difficult to do, as long as you, again, I think that, so I don't think that the moves were difficult to do, but I do think they require strong relationship building, and a lot of outreach and a lot of understanding of like political organizations and timing and stuff like that. And I think I was good at all of those. I think those, going back to the conversation around like what are the strong suits, what are the weak suits, those were always my strong suits. So like, yes, for me, moving around, I did not find it particularly difficult to move around. Now, somebody with a different set of strengths and weaknesses might have a really difficult time moving around. So I think it really depends on the individual, what comes naturally to you, what's, a little bit more difficult to do.
Anything else that you want to talk about with your experience with Morgan Stanley?
No, I mean, I had
Yeah.
a great experience overall. For sure, I realized that financial services isn't the industry that I want to be in. So as much as I actually do like Morgan Stanley as a firm a lot, I think that if I was talking to somebody who wanted to be within financial services, Morgan Stanley is certainly a firm that I would like recommend to them. But at the end of the day, you have to take a step back and you have to think about, like, is this the right industry for me to be in? And for me, the final product of financial services, it has to do with moving money around. It has to do, like, yes, you can take that a step further and you could say, well, by moving money around, you're creating all of these opportunities, you're financing, public sector projects, you're doing all of this stuff that has a positive impact. And I don't disagree with any of that stuff, but it's a little bit too far removed in terms of the impact for me to get excited about it, right? I need to be a little bit closer to the impact, right? And so I'm not gonna, like, yes, if you're financing a bridge, are you having a positive impact on that city? Well, of course, that city needed that bridge and so forth. That's a little bit too far removed for me to be like, I helped build this bridge.
Yeah.
And for me, I get excited, about waking up in the morning and going to work when I was in financial services versus, I feel much more excited in other roles and other stages of life. So I kind of view my time at Morgan Stanley as like, this was good, 5 or 6 years while I was there, learned a lot, appreciated the people, fantastic firm. Industry wasn't a really good fit, but was a great place for me to kind of start my career and learn a lot.
Yeah. And so, what did you do after Morgan Stanley?
After Morgan Stanley, I got into business school at that point, so I ended up leaving a little bit early so that I could go and spend a few months in China working for an education company. And, I was helping this organization build partnerships with US universities. And I was, um, you know, I was doing a professional development course and teaching a course on public speaking. And it was this fantastic experience for so many reasons. This was my first time really in living outside of the U.S. And that was just this eye-opening experience, which was fantastic. And at that point, I wanted to, when I first started at Morgan Stanley, I wanted to basically work in New York for 2 years, and then I wanted to do a third year kind of rotation in Hong Kong. That was like the plan I had in my head, because I never had the opportunity to study abroad during college. And so I really wanted this international thing. And so I was like, okay, I'm finally at a stage where there's no reason I can't go abroad right now. I know that I'm going to be starting business school in August anyway, so I can go and do whatever I want to this summer. And so I ended up going to this education company in China, and really loved that experience.
How did you like China?
I mean, I like the experience of being abroad. I think that, it's kind of saying, how do you like China is kind of like saying, how do you like the US? And by that, I mean, like, what part of China are we talking about? Like, I was based in Chengdu. Chengdu is not Shanghai. Shanghai is not Beijing. Beijing is not Guangzhou, yeah, Shenzhen. There's like, it's just like New York, is different from Alabama, is different from Arkansas, is different from all of these other places. Um, so it is a little bit like, I think that it's like, it really depends on what city that you're in and so forth. On aggregate, though, I would say that I had a really difficult time in Chengdu because English is not widely used there, right? So on the one hand, it was a cool experience because I was able to realize just how much you can do with technology, right? So I had like my little translator app, and I could go into a restaurant and I could type in one word at a time. I could type in
Yeah.
chicken, I could type in beet, beef, I could type in like rice and just show the screen, and the person would nod and the food would come out, and it'd be great. And I could even, like, when I was looking to find a gym, I could even go and type in like locker and then show it to them, and like treadmill and then show it to them, and then like weights and then show it to them, and was
Yeah.
able to kind of do a full back and forth tour. So obviously you're able to, it's surprising how you can navigate. And then little things like, whenever I'd go from one place to another, I would just take the business card of the restaurant or the hotel, so that if I was ever trying to get back to something in that area, I could just hail a cab, and then I could just like hand the business card to them, and then thumbs up, and they take you there. So little things like that. So like I had all of these business cards. I got all these business cards of all these restaurants and stuff.
Yeah.
um, and that really helped me get from place to place. But I realized, so in that experience, I realized I don't want to be in a country where I don't speak the language, where I don't speak any of the languages that's readily used. That is an experience that I don't necessarily want to have that experience again. But I did love the experience of being abroad. I just felt like I was able to choose my own life and my own identity and live and all of this stuff. And I liked that a lot. And so I kind of knew, okay, at some point, I want to be somewhere where I still want to be abroad, but I want to be able to get by. So that means I either have to learn the language, or I have to be in a place where English is the primary language. And of course, Singapore fits that very well. Everybody here speaks English, and so there's no issue there.
What was your process with business school? Were you considering other schools outside of Harvard?
Yeah, I researched other schools, um, but by the time I came to applying, Harvard was the only school that I applied to. So I think that when people apply to MBA programs, they often apply to a whole lot of programs, and they think about like, oh, I'll just want to go, to an MBA program. I personally feel like, an MBA program, I would kind of compare it to, marriage in some ways, in that it sticks with you for life, right? Like you make this decision, and then this decision is your decision for life. Um, and it is like nobody's kind of walking around trying to find the second best person or the third best person, or just that person that's going to
Yeah.
say yes to them. Like
Yeah.
that's not the mindset that you have when you're making that kind of decision. And so I don't, that's not the mindset that I had when I was looking at business school. And so from my perspective, I was like, I'm going to find the school that's the best for me, and then that's the one school I want to go to. I don't want to just like blanket application to a whole bunch of places, see which ones say yes to me, and then go there. My thought process was like, I at least want to take two shots at the place that I'm most excited about. So I applied to HBS, and the thought process was, if I don't get into HBS this year, then I'll reapply next year, and I'll apply to a few, maybe eventually I'll apply to a few other schools. Because I guess you get to a point where you're like, all right, maybe if you apply a bunch of time, maybe if you apply 3 times and you haven't gotten in 3 times, you have to get to the point of saying, okay, maybe it's not going to be a fit here. So
Yeah.
now if I'm deciding between not going or going to one of these other schools, but I at least wanted to give myself 2 shot attempts, because there are a lot of people that apply to something, don't get it the first time around, apply again, get it the second time around. Um, yeah, but that was my thought process, but I was very targeted with it.
And so, speak about your experience at Harvard. Uh, what did you love about what they were doing? If any constructive criticisms?
I mean, I love Harvard. If I was building a business school from scratch, it would look almost identical. It's scary how close it would look to Harvard. And I love Singapore in the same way. If I were building a country from scratch, it would look a lot like Singapore, um, more so than any other country I've seen. And similarly, if I were building a business school from scratch, it would look more like HBS than any other country that I've seen.
Yeah.
Than any other school that I've seen. And yeah, I just think that you have a tremendous amount of opportunities at the place. The professors are so invested in you. If you go to the website and you look at the like profiles of the professors, like I typed up this summary, and if anybody's listening and wants the summary, they can just send me a message on LinkedIn asking for my my second year MBA, summary, and I have something that I typed up and I can send it along. But it basically, it's like all the courses that I took in my second year with links to the faculty pages of the professors that I worked with. um, and it just like blows my mind, some of the professors that I was able to get exposed to during my time at HBS, the experiences that they had before becoming a professor. Taking a seminar with the guy that, like, now he's the CEO of GE. So he was the CEO of Danaher, then he came and he taught leadership at HBS, and now he's the CEO of GE. And it's like, look, if that's the person that you're like learning from,
Yeah.
or at another professor who was like one of the founders of Bain Capital, and like another professor who is on the board of like IBM and sort of every technology and operations related top organization you could think of. This person has like spent time on the board of directors, and multiple professors that were CEOs. And it's like, if those are the people that you're learning from day in and day out, like, that good things are gonna come with that. So I absolutely love the institution. I think it has a reputation of being like a cold place with people with hard elbows. That's not at all what my experience was. Like, I actually feel like the student body at HBS is warm, caring. They're super passionate about changing the world in a positive direction. I was very positively blown away by the number of people who were interested and passionate about like education and the same exact things that I was really passionate about. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, overall, I just loved it across the board.
Any pieces of advice to anybody on any part of, you know, applying to business school or doing something while you're at business school, taking a certain class or doing a certain activity or anything of that nature?
Um, I would say my advice would be, talk to people who have done the programs that you're interested in doing, both current students and then alumni. Find alumni that are doing things in the spaces that you're interested in, and have conversations with them. Come into the MBA program with a game plan in terms of like, I want to spend my time doing this, this, and this. So in my case, I went into the MBA program knowing that I wanted to run for student body co-president, knowing that I wanted to run for education rep for my section, which basically means you're the liaison between an HBS class is 930 per year, which is broken up into 10 sections of 93. Every one of those sections has a liaison that is the counterpart, the person in between the students and the professors, in terms of students providing feedback to professors, professors providing feedback to the section, not individual feedback to individual. So it's not like, hey, person A, person B, person C, this is where you improve. That's not the type of feedback. It's more like, hey, as a section, collectively, you all need to get better at disagreeing with each other more often. Like, we have to have constructive debate in this classroom. And I think that, it seems like you all are just hesitant to disagree, probably because, you have social relationships as well. But, part of the way this experience works is realizing that there's respectful ways to disagree with people, and look, to have a case discussion, we need more disagreement. So things like that. But I want to be a professor one day. So for me, it was cool to kind of be in the seat and to see the classroom experience through a professor's eyes. Um, and then in addition to that, I knew that I wanted to do consulting. I knew that BCG was going to be my top choice if I was able to get the opportunity. So I was able to come into business school very targeted, knowing how I wanted to spend my time. And I think that I was able to accomplish all of the things really that I wanted to accomplish during business school. And I think it's because I came in with a very clear set of priorities. So I didn't have to do too much exploration. And did I keep my eyes open? Certainly I did, but the way I like to compare it to, it's like if you're a fan of EDM music and you go to a concert of some sort, the DJ has more or less like selected their playlist before the concert actually begins, and they're just pressing play. And do they make some modifications here based on them seeing the reaction to the crowd? Of course. Like, they might do something to the volume, they might do something to the lighting, they might add a little bit of steam here and there. But like for the most part, what that DJ was performing was pre-decided. Um, and I think that that's kind of how I think about my MBA experience. Like, I came in with a pre-decided, this is what I'm going to do, and then I just made some adjustments here and there.
And speak to wanting to go into consulting. What drew you to Boston Consulting Group?
Yeah. So wanting to go into consulting, I knew that I wanted to basically have this opportunity to see a bunch of different industries. I knew that I had basically, when I was deciding between different firms, and I was particularly looking very heavily at like BCG, Bain, and McKinsey. And when I was deciding between different firms, I took a blank piece of paper and I wrote down all the people I knew at BCG, all the people I knew at Bain, all the people I knew at McKinsey. And then I just asked myself not only the traditional like airport test kind of questions, but I asked myself things like, um, you know, if I were going on vacation, who would I want to go on vacation with? If I were, up to the point where it's like, okay, picture myself getting married. Who am I excited to have in the audience at my wedding? Right. And when I looked at these names of people, it's not like, it's not like one list was, oh, these are good people and these are not good people. That's not the way I thought about it. But for sure, it was like, oh, I gravitate towards this list of people. And over and over and over again, it was like BCG, BCG, BCG. And I think that people should really pick based on that. Right. And I realized that for the first time, because this is also the same way that I picked when I was deciding between Goldman and Morgan Stanley, was that same exact thing. And then when I would look at the individuals, it was Morgan Stanley, Morgan Stanley, Morgan Stanley, Morgan Stanley. And when I remember when I would talk to my classmates, so many of them were just like, wow, like why did you decide to go to Morgan Stanley over Goldman? Because without a doubt, Goldman is the more kind of prestigious name, quote unquote. um, and I think that you really have to not make these decisions solely on the basis of prestige, but also decide on the basis of culture, especially when you're deciding between things that like it might one be more prestigious than the other. Well, sure, but they're both in the highest sphere of like,
Yeah.
they're both neck and neck. You're talking about like Harvard Yale type of dynamic. And when you're talking about that type of dynamic, like it doesn't matter if one has a slight edge over the other, as it for sure matters in terms of, are you selecting the one that you're a better cultural fit, because they're not the same. That's the argument that a lot of people will make is, yeah, but they're basically the same thing anyway. They're not the same. These places have very different cultures. um, and if you pick a culture that you align to, you'll be successful. If you don't, you're setting yourself up for less success. And I guess one thing I'd say, just looking and being cognizant of the time, if people do have follow-up questions, please do feel free to like send me a message on LinkedIn. I'm happy to address follow-up questions that way. But I'm also happy if there's like one kind of final question or anything like that that you wanted to ask. I'm
Are
also
you
happy
are
to.
you are you in a rush?
I do. I will have to
Okay.
drop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. So then I'll I guess just maybe for a minute speak about your coaching opportunities, and the workshops you're doing, things of that nature.
Yep. So I'm very passionate about executive coaching, giving back, talent management, development, everything like that. And so I have a lot of people that will reach out to me on LinkedIn. And I used to, early in my career, do my best to have one-on-one conversations with everybody that reached out. That's not sustainable. In fact, at one point, just because I was like curious, I actually did the math in terms of like, okay, if I said yes to everybody that sends me a message on LinkedIn, and I offered 30-minute conversations with each of those, it literally was more minutes than there were in the day. And so I was like, okay, it's physically not possible. And that was like a realization. And I realized, okay, with time, that number is only going to increase in terms of the people that reach out to me. So what can I, what can I do to be able to offer something to everybody? Um, my solution was eventually to create this ecosystem. So I launched a website. It's just my name. So it's just tristonfrancis.com. On the website, you can click on upcoming events. I have events every single week. So effectively, if there's something you're looking to talk to me about, you can join one of these events. They all have different moderators. People can sign up to be a moderator if they choose. So if they're, people, sometimes people will look at the list of upcoming events and they'll say, well, none of these events are really the topics that are on my mind. And so the solution to that is like, okay, well, create the agenda, and then I can have a conversation around that particular topic, so long as like you or somebody else is willing to moderate that discussion. So it's allowed me to say yes to a much higher percentage of people than I would have been able to. And, that to me, like, I feel really good about that, because like as a first generation college student, that's, oftentimes the most difficult thing is like just not even knowing where to begin. And so this platform, I think, at least gives people an outlet to say, look, if you're ambitious and you want to do X, Y, and Z, you know, tune in here, and at least we can have a conversation that hopefully helps you have a heads up in terms of like where to begin. So if people have, different things they want to discuss, they think that I'll be able to provide a helpful perspective. I always have reoccurring events around for people who are interested in HBS and for people who are interested in consulting. So at any point in time, pretty much every single month, you'll be able to go to the website and sign up for one of those. But then there's also other topics as well that people can sign up for.
Best way to contact you is LinkedIn or
LinkedIn,
website.
LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah, LinkedIn's the best way.
Perfect. So Tristan, thank you for being on. I just want to acknowledge you. It was amazing to hear from your story, your work ethic, and just always, being ambitious to continue to push yourself. And I hope that people gain a lot of value from what you had to say.
Yep, I appreciate it. Thank you again for having me, and for those who listen, thank you for taking the time to listen, and hopefully our paths cross at some point.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.